Hello, welcome to today's webinar on third-party risk management. My name is Philip Greaves. We're really happy for you to join us today for this update. Just a few reminders before we get started, a couple of administrative points. We are recording the webinar today, and that will be available on demand following the event. As just a first option, if you have a choice, the platform's preferred browser is Chrome. It will work on other platforms, but it appears to work best on Chrome. You can adjust your webinar audio by using the media player at the bottom of the screen. Lastly, if there are any technical difficulties during the webinar, please do submit comments on our Q&A panel, and a moderator will try and address any technical queries you have as best as possible. We do want to make this session as interactive as possible at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, then please do submit those into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions at the end of the webinar. The session today is about an hour long, but we'll leave plenty of time at the end to address any of your questions. So just in terms of introductions, first of all, my name's Philip Greaves. I'm a director within our technology consulting practice within Protiviti UK. Apologies, I'm jumping slides on too far. I lead our third-party risk and privacy practices within the UK. I've been with Protiviti about 10 years and was with Anderson and Deloitte before that. We do a lot of work within the third-party risk space, ranging from building frameworks for clients, completing third-party risk assessments, as well as assessing and implementing tooling for our clients. So we just wanted to do this webinar to share some of our insights, what we see in the market, what our clients are, some of the challenges our clients are facing, as well as some of the regulatory challenges we see. I'll just hand over to Toby briefly, and he will introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. My name is Toby Chan. I'm working closely with Phil in our Protiviti London office. I have been with Protiviti for over 8 years now, working on various projects in the vendor risk space. And over the last 2 years, really closely working on the various platforms and how we set up the frameworks from the vendor risk perspective, as well as the implementation on some of the technologies to really automate and streamline how we manage the vendors' assessments and collections and evidence as well. And I'll go into that in a little bit detail in one of the sections later. Back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Toby. So we'll move on to the agenda. So number of things we wanted to talk about today. The first thing we wanted to cover was just to provide a bit of an overview of the changing landscape of regulation that we see and some of the drivers for why third-party risk is increasing, and it's increasing the number of conversations that we're having with our clients. Then we wanted to move on to talk about some of the key challenges. Slightly different focus for this, but we are running a weekly COVID-19 knowledge sharing forum, really for our clients to talk to each other, facilitated by us, about some of the challenges they're facing with remote working and all other aspects of COVID-19. And third parties has been a running theme within that forum that's been running for about 8 to 10 weeks now. So we wanted to share some of the insights in terms of supply chain risk, which are coming out of that. Next, we'll move on to some key components of effective third-party risk management, some of the things that we do see organizations doing, but also some of the things that perhaps are less mature within some organizations. And then I'll hand over to Toby, who will take you through some technology enablers. We work with a lot of technologies, and we're seeing quite a trend in the market in terms of the increase of technology to support third-party risk management. And lastly, we just wanted to reflect on some of the broader integration and importance of integration with the broader supply chain and other functions within your organization. So moving on to the regulation and the changing landscape within the UK and Europe. One of the things that's been particularly noticeable when attending conferences and talking to clients is the comparative difference in maturity between Europe and the US. As you'll see on this slide, there's been a whole series of different regulatory requirements, some of them industry specific, but many of them not, which has driven a much greater level of third-party risk maturity within the US. There are organizations such as Shared Assessments, for example, which are very centered within the US market, although they are looking to extend, who are a knowledge sharing and thought leadership organization and put out a lot of really strong material. We actually sit on the steering committee both in the US and in Europe. But it's noticeable that it's a very widespread organization that has not necessarily moved across, or it's in the process of moving across and to build third-party risk as a more formal discipline. In the UK, what we found is, with the exception of perhaps financial services and the FCA handbook and specifically SIS-GATE in relation to outsourcing requirements, the guidelines and around third-party risk management has been a lot more limited. And therefore, even within a regulated industry such as financial services, we've seen a significant difference in the maturity of processes. And that doesn't necessarily correlate between larger financial services and small. There's been quite significant differences in maturity throughout. What has probably changed in the last few years, first of all, GDPR has obviously came in within 2018. This is obviously a cross-industry piece of regulation and does cover some requirements, and I'll come back to those in a minute in terms of due diligence around your third parties. Next, last year, came the EBA outsourcing guidelines, which from the European Banking Authority, financial services focused, obviously, but has provided a lot more clarity to organisations in terms of requirements for third-party risk management. And then more latterly, towards the back end of last year, the Bank of England published a consultation paper in relation to outsourcing and third-party risk management. And these are providing a lot more clarity in the market. I'm just going to explore a couple of those in a little bit more detail. So first, the Bank of England. Now, this is technically focused around, is part of the guidance around operational resilience. So this is a consultation paper published to the financial services industry. But I think the thing that's important is it provides some really good guidance in terms of what good activities organisations should be thinking about in relation to third-party risk management, regardless of whether they are within the financial services industry or not. I'm not going to go through all of these here, and that would probably be a webinar in its own right. But I'll just pick out a couple of them which are particularly interesting. One of them on the left-hand side, systemic concentration risk, as well as sub-outsourcing, come quite hand in hand. So we've seen that with the I guess growing speed of cloud services, particularly Amazon Web Services and Azure, that first of all is introducing a lot of fourth parties, i.e. sub-outsourcing, but it's also creating potential systemic concentration risks. So large amounts of the financial service sector, for example, there is a danger that many of the large banks, for example, if there was a major failure within AWS, for example, that might have a systemic risk across multiple banks where they're sharing the same data centers. And there's increasingly attention from regulators as to how the industry might deal with that. But nonetheless, outside of financial services, understanding your sub-outsourcing, and that's not always cloud services, but it has increased the number of sub-outsourcing or fourth parties that exist for organizations. It's important that you not only understand your third parties, but also the key fourth parties which sit underneath those third parties. Just moving around on the left-hand side, data security has probably, particularly within the sort of information economy, data security is probably a focus area for many organizations in terms of assessing the information security and the information risk associated to their third parties. So probably an area that's slightly more mature than some of the other areas of operational risk. Coming down the right-hand side, so proportionality. Proportionality is the risk to the firm. So this is quite a financial services focused area, but potentially a large scale, let's say one of the big four retail banks in the UK, may have a much more significant impact on the overall market than a small investment manager or a small financial services firm. Materiality is more focused on the risk of the actual third party. So that's a concept that is important, that our third party risk processes are risk focused in their own right as well. So are we looking at the most risky third parties? Last point I just wanted to pull out of this slide was the focus around record keeping. So this very much links into GDPR as well, where there is an importance to understand where your personal data sits, regardless of whether that's internal or within your third parties. And I think this links back very nicely. There is an expectation that organizations have a good understanding of what their third parties are. And coming back to the cloud example, that's been one of the challenges historically, or more recently, is that now the business can in theory engage third parties with limited input potentially from IT, from procurement. So I have spoken to clients where they have spun up instances of AWS or Azure, and you can very quickly rack up quite significant bills with those providers if you don't control that cloud service appropriately. And obviously, because the OT is being provided outside of the organization, that can be set up with quite limited input from other control functions within the organization. Moving on, I just wanted to reflect on GDPR quite quickly. So GDPR doesn't say lots and lots about third-party risk, but it does make reference within Article 28. Lots of organizations have focused on ensuring that the contractual provisions for GDPR have been updated within third-party contracts. What we don't see quite as mature is the requirements also within the article for some level of audit and due diligence. This is mandated, but also can be seen as good practice. So if you're thinking about the risk to your organization, the privacy risk, which might also include the regulatory risk of fines from the ICO, for example, it's important that you know where that personal data is, and that may be sitting with third parties or being managed or processed by third parties rather than internally within your organization. This has a significant impact on your privacy processes as well. So if you have to respond to the regulator within a 72-hour period according to the regulation, you may need to engage with those third parties within that time frame. Similarly, if you're putting in place processes such as data subject rights requests. Some of that data may be held with third parties, so you have 30 days to respond to that data subject rights request, and that process may involve engagement with your third parties. So I think GDPR has made organizations start to look at how they engage with their third parties because they may need to engage them as part of these processes. And as I said before, they may represent quite significant risk. So we have, over the last few years, over the last 5 to 10 years, seen quite a number of data breaches caused by breaches at third parties. Your organization will be liable for that regulatory fine potentially if there is a breach at your third party. So it's important that you think about personal data as part of your third-party risk as well. Moving on, I just wanted to reflect on some of the issues that we see coming out of the recent COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm sure it's impacting sort of everyone's daily life. It would be difficult for it not to on this forum. And that's had a number of impacts in terms of how organizations work, how we all work in terms of our having to remotely work from home. Clearly there are significant health issues on top of that as well, but this has an impact on third parties as well. And we, as I mentioned, have been running a COVID-19 forum for the last 8 to 10 weeks. Really an opportunity for our clients to share their experiences, what's worked well, what's not worked so well. For most organizations, this is the first type of continuity event of this sort. Some of our clients, obviously, who have Asian operations were perhaps impacted more by SARS and MERS previously. But for many organizations, this is the first type of continuity event that they've been through, such as this. And there's significant lessons to be learned by organizations sharing information. So some of the lessons that we've seen, I guess, coming and feedback that we've seen coming through that forum links back to many of the things within the third-party guidance that we've already talked about. So do you understand your key suppliers, for example? Important that you have that clear inventory. Step one is understanding that inventory, and very much links back to the Bank of England guidance that I outlined before. Do you understand where those third parties all reside? I think has been a challenge for many organisations. One of the things that sort of came out in the manufacturing sector around Chinese manufacturing, for example, is that many manufacturing third parties are potentially, as they got to year end, holding lower levels of inventory within their organisation going into Christmas. And then obviously within the Chinese region, Chinese New Year is in the early part of the year. So what they found and the impact that had as COVID-19 hit is that inventory levels for many organizations were hit particularly hard where organizations were dependent on a Chinese supply chain. Obviously more relevant to manufacturing sector or sectors dependent on parts or supplies from the Far East. One of the things that clients have been looking at is in terms of how do they identify alternative supply. So in instances where third parties may be struggling to supply, where they can identify alternative sources of supplies. But this links to the second orange bullet associated to that is potentially risk that's being introduced to organizations because they're having to move to alternative suppliers quite quickly. And this sort of links back to the efficiency and the agility of your third-party risk process. So obviously in a time of crisis, following third-party risk processes may not be the number one priority, but at the same time, it's important if you have had to bring in alternative suppliers that perhaps you need to revisit those suppliers and make sure the due diligence is done retrospectively to make sure that they're not introducing new risks to your organization. I'll move on to sustainability. So organizations having to look at their supply chain and their key vendors and what sort of risks were being introduced as a result of the supply chain. So the ability of certain third parties to actually sustain the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, there will be companies going out of business or companies that are in distress. And this kind of links back to the effectiveness of some of the risk management processes. Historically, many organizations have looked at the efficiency of the supply chain and looked for just-in-time processing and the leanness of supply chains. But this, in a way, may, linking back to my Chinese example, may actually mean that there's insufficient resilience within the supply chain in times where some of your key suppliers may be struggling. So that's an important dynamic. Sometimes within the information economy and much of the work that we do, there's a significant focus around information risk, but actually making sure that the financial due diligence is completed and how that flows into your third-party risk management process is important to make sure that some of these sort of stress tests are completed at the time you take on third parties. And lastly, information security. So one of the things that we've been talking to a number of clients is they inevitably have had to change ways of working quite substantially for their workforce. And this will apply to your third parties as well. And in those instances, the focus has been in terms of mobilizing organizations. And that might be through the deployment of Zoom, that might be through the rollout of Teams or other collaboration technologies, but also just redesigning processes to work remotely. And that has potentially, because of the focus around, apologies, the slide's just jumping around a little bit, that has led to potential information security risks, which could be hitting your third parties as well. So one of the things that we're seeing is information security teams going back to look at some of the changes that have been made in the ways of working that could have introduced information risk within the organization. And it's important that you think about this within your third-party program. Has your third party introduced different collaboration techniques or ways of working that might have increased the risk to you as an organization? And that's something that organizations are starting to think about in terms of any COVID-19 planning or resilience activities that they have ongoing. Moving on, I wanted just to highlight some of the key components of effective third-party risk management. Some of these, we won't necessarily go into all of these in significant detail, but I just wanted to call out some of the areas where we're seeing more maturity, less maturity, and how that sort of comes through in third-party risk management processes. So first of all, I wanted to sort of reference the vendor identification process up front. So what a lot of organizations talk to us about is that one of their major risks is just knowing what third parties they have in place. This is particularly the case for really large organizations who may have thousands and in many cases tens of thousands of third parties. So making sure that the processes and the connection processes between third-party risk and procurement, for example, or how the business engages third parties is critical to try and make sure that we have a complete population of third parties. Moving on to risk segmentation, I think historically many of these processes have been led by procurement, who are not always focused on the same objectives as third-party risk programs. So historically, third parties would have been assessed based on spend, really to support procurement with negotiation of pricing. But third-party risk needs to make sure that you're focused on the risk to the business, whether that be information risk or any other operational risk that the third party may be subjecting you to. And we've seen quite a change in that over the last few years. I'll then come on to vendor scanning in the third column. So one of the things that's quite new to the market is historically organizations used to do point-in-time assessments. Those would generally happen at the time of onboarding a new third party or selecting a new third party, and ideally on an ongoing basis, perhaps annually or every other year, to reassess a third party. What we're seeing more of is the use of tooling to provide continuous monitoring to clients, and this could be in a number of ways. So this could involve scanning of the vulnerability scanning of the third-party perimeter of the organization, but could also involve approaches. One of the vendors that we're demoing later does sort of use a part of its solution called Vendorpedia, which brings you a lot of information on that vendor before you've even done an assessment. So based on information, the assessments that have been done by other clients on their platform, they can bring information which helps you to risk assess that vendor. That might be financial information, might be background information, may in some cases be information risk type information. I then just wanted to move on to vendor offboarding. So this is an area which I think many organizations are less mature on. So this is thinking about the risks that exist as you exit certain third parties. I think GDPR has brought this to light a lot more. One of the key risks, I think, from a GDPR and a privacy perspective, is thinking about the data that your third parties hold, and making sure if you have the right to, and this normally comes down to whether they are a processor to you or a joint controller, do they have the right to hold that customer data, that personal data, after exiting the relationship with you? And many third-party programs we see don't necessarily get involved at the back end, and there is a risk that we exit vendors and they're holding quite sensitive personal data that they might contractually not have the right to hold. So putting in place processes which ensure that the third-party risk team is engaged at the back end at the exiting of third parties is really critical. We're going to come on to sort of reporting and third-party risk technologies later in the webinar, so I won't reflect too much on those at the bottom in the orange bars. A couple of areas I just wanted to reflect on in a little bit more detail. So first of all, risk assessment and segmentation. So risk assessment, as I mentioned, historically segmentation was often done by spend. Most organizations we speak to now do understand the importance of driving that by risk. This does need, though, to be a shared activity often between the business owner of the third party or the relationship manager and potentially subject matter experts. So if we're thinking about information risk, does the business owner have all the information required to really assess the information risk of that third party? It sort of depends on the business, but sometimes it's important that they engage with the subject matter expertise in the information security team, for example, to make sure that those risks are being considered when we do segment those vendors. And then next, one of the things that we still see is, despite the fact that risk assessment is more common practice at many programs that we see, is that we still see quite standardized approaches regardless of risk. So one of the things that, as organizations mature is moving to a much more risk-based approach, is not just the segmentation, but thinking about the level of assurance we required that maps the risk of that third party. And that may range from no assessment for low-risk third parties, particularly in organizations that might have tens of thousands of third parties. Many of those third parties don't present a material risk to us if they go out of business. An example being a low-level stationery provider. We may have multiple stationery providers. If one of them went out of business, may not impact us. Similarly, it's not necessarily presenting a significant information risk to us. That said, there will be organizations where a stationery supplier is absolutely critical. So it will depend on organization by organization. But it's important that assessment approach is very much proportionate to the risk that is identified within your segmentation process. Moving on, we've seen a bit of a sort of maturing, I think, of the assessments, and I'm focusing here on information risk specifically. So organizations use a number of frameworks historically. Those might be NIST, they may be ISO. I've mentioned shared assessments. So shared assessments has a framework called SIG. SIG-Lite includes about 300 questions and can be purchased by organizations if they're looking to buy an industry standard. So shared assessments is starting to gain some traction in Europe as well as the US. Obviously, organizations have been embedding privacy questions on the back of GDPR. And we see organizations using frameworks such as CSA, the Cloud Security Alliance, specifically for third parties who are cloud-based. So we're seeing and evolving, I think, and it's a complex process to build control frameworks which are specific to your third parties. You clearly need to get enough due diligence, but equally, we really see some frameworks which are enormous. So thinking about consolidation and the number of questions is important, because there is a dynamic between risk management and the relationship we have on the third parties. Whilst 300 questions to your third party might get you lots of comfort, it also takes a lot of time for your third party when they're not necessarily focused on providing you service. So there is a balance in terms of getting the level of due diligence right, and that needs to be risk-based. Can we ask some of our low-risk third parties 30 questions and maybe reserve the larger question sets for our most high critical or material outsourcing? Okay, so we do a lot of work across technologies and across vendors, and outlined on the slide, which is coming up onto your screen, are both Gartner Magic Quadrant and Forrester New Wave surveys. There are a number of tools in the market. These vary from tools which are more focused around just third-party risk, such as Prevalent, for example. OneTrust historically has been known as a privacy vendor. I'm sure many of you are familiar with OneTrust, and it's a very popular tool for privacy, but it's also gaining a lot of traction as a third-party risk management tool. Other platforms such as Coupa and RSA have more of a background in GRC and helping organizations document and record their risk and controls internally, but they've moved into the third-party risk management space. And then there's tools such as ServiceNow, historically an IT service management tool, but they've also, as they've moved towards GRC, started to enhance their capabilities around third-party risk management. So there's a lot of tools out there. What we still see is very mixed usage of tools, though. So what I'm just going to reflect on the next slide is a sort of maturity rating scale that we see many organizations in terms of their adoption of technology. First of all, technology is not a silver bullet. It's not. We still see organizations who have implemented technology but have perhaps not implemented it well. So it's not the be-all and end-all, but I think some of these technologies are really helping to streamline the process for organizations, and Toby will be taking you through that shortly. So this is a maturity scale. We're going to focus on the managed level. So how do you put in place a more integrated vendor risk management platform? But we do see organizations at varying levels. So a lot of organizations still using on-premise third-party risk platforms. The difficulty with these is that it's quite hard for your vendors to access these. So the more modern vendor risk platforms are generally cloud-based because it allows both your organization and your third parties to access and input data and provide a much more free-flowing flow of information between you and your vendor and capture and try and get away from the use of spreadsheets and more manual processes. And lastly, before I hand over to Toby, that's just what we're trying to represent on this slide that's sort of coming up now. So GRC being at the center of your engagement with third parties. As I said, historically, these processes, or even some significant financial service organizations, have been on spreadsheets, and that works for maybe tens of vendors. But once you get up to hundreds of vendors or even thousands of vendors, then tracking the risk assessments, tracking the remediation can be very, very challenging. And that's not least before you start trying to report and aggregate your risk view across your vendor population. So we've seen an increase in some of these platforms that are cloud-based and very much central to how you engage with your third parties. That's not to say you should be talking to your third parties, but these are a facilitator to support the flow of information with your third parties, particularly around information risk. I'm now going to hand over to Toby, who is going to take you through some sort of a case study of some of the opportunities for automation that we see and we've been implementing with some of our clients. Over to you, Toby.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Let me just move on to the next slide. So before I kind of dive into, as mentioned earlier by Phil, we do work closely with a number of these platforms in setting up the third-party risk management framework. But for the purpose of today's session, I will be using screenshots from OneTrust platform and really just to demonstrate some of the key components and capabilities of these platforms. And on this slide, one of the key, I guess the first component and the ability is to be able to view and really drill down on a particular vendor. You can see that this includes a general information such as their background, contact detail, locations, but then it also tracks a summary of their security certificates obtained by the vendors. And we do find that this to be particularly useful for large vendors like Google, or in this instance, Atlassian on the screen, where organizations may leverage one or multiple solutions provided by the vendors. But this is just another good way to allow you to track the specific certificate provided by the service or the solutions that you are using. And if we're moving on to sort of the assessment section, another key benefit and perhaps the ability is to tailor and change questions based on your requirement and need. Whilst most vendors provide some level of certifications these days, whether that be ISO, NIST, or the shared assessment or SIG-Lights, we found that most organizations not only rely on these certifications alone, but they often will request additional controls and questions on top of the standardized certificate. And as you can see there in the tool, it also gives you the ability and the flexibility to really tailor some of these questions in the various formats that you want to. You can include yes/no questions, multi-select. You can also require vendors to really provide attachments to support their responses. On the right-hand side here, you can also see there's also a library of templates that you can leverage from, which is another key benefit that would save you from having to download the latest version of the shared assessment or the cloud security assessment. These are all kept centrally. Moving on. And really coming back to the single lens and single view on your vendors, the other key benefit that we found is the ability to track all your risks that are associated to the specific vendors. These risks can be manually flagged following the review of the assessment that you have sent out to the vendors, or these can be built through rules which can be automatically flagged through the assessments. So you may have specific questions that you send out to the vendors, and if the answers to those questions are no, then it will automatically flag a risk within the systems. It just helps you automate that process of having someone else reviewing that manual steps and then manually flagging all those risks for you. At the same time, you can also categorize these risks by the type of risk as well as the inherent level. These are all customizable and adjustable within the systems, which then sort of leads nicely into the next slide that comes up. And ultimately, you wanted to be able to have this view of a aggregate vendor view across your vendor portfolios. And really, some of the key dashboard functionality that we have seen across all of the platform is the ability to track the vendors by the type of the vendors, as well as any outstanding assessments, outstanding risks that are associated to it. And when you do click through some of these graphs, it can then also drill down into the specific vendors that are overdue or that has a risk that hasn't been remediated in a timely manner. Whilst most of these platforms do provide some level of these dashboarding, and this is just one of the examples, but when we do work with some of the organizations, they tend to have their own separate reporting, or as Phil mentioned, they may have their own GRC platform. So sometimes it's quite common, and often we see that organizations tend to, rather than using the existing dashboard reporting, but really extract the data and then import it into their own GRC platforms, or they might actually extract the data and then represent it in their own data visualization tools like Power BI or SharePoint, which is already pre-built and pre-exists. Coming on to the last slide. So in summary, all of the platforms that we work closely with will have most, if not all of those key components and capabilities that I've highlighted in the previous slide. And we really wanted just to include a couple of key points for you to consider when you're trying to decide which platform or if a platform is suitable to manage the vendor risk depending on the size. And one of the first points to start off is to think about and really look at the number of third parties that you have on hand. That also includes the number of assessments that you carry out on an annual basis, because cost models across different platforms are different. Some would be charging based on the number of active vendors you have, whilst others would then charge you based on the number of assessments that you sent out. And another point to consider is really looking back to the slides on GDPR earlier. It's really looking at where the hosting locations of these platforms will be and whether that data will sit outside of the EEA jurisdictions. And obviously, that's particularly important for GDPR. Another key benefit when deciding is to consider the managed services and also the outsourcing solutions on some of these platforms. You may want to decide that we wanted to outsource the chasing part of these vendor assessment to some of these platforms, and they also do that for you. And the second last thing on the value-added services, this is really highlighting on that vendor security scanning services that has provided. As you mentioned, OneTrust does have the proprietary Vendorpedia, where they have a library of certifications and assessments for well-known vendors, and that can be shared by the users of the platforms. Separately, another one to note is Prevalent. They also have their own version of vendor threat monitoring, where they will actively scan the dark web and really look at any adverse news on the vendors that you have and provide you with a live alert whenever these things occur. And lastly, it kind of ties in back to the integrations on how the data is being extracted. In addition to how it integrates with sort of the GRC platforms, is that how well it really links up to perhaps a procurement platform like Cooper, how does the data flow from one to another, but also how does it integrate with external services like Big Sight and Security Scorecard. We're seeing an increase use from our clients where not only do they want to do an assessment, but they also will request a one-off security scorecard scorings on a particular vendor, especially the high-risk vendors. Great. That's all on my side. I'll pass it back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Toby. So if we move on to just the final part of the presentation, just a couple of minutes before we hand back to Q&A, one of the things that we still see, you'll see on screen, hopefully, the integrated approach to third-party risk. So this is a view of the end-to-end supplier life cycle. I'm just waiting for the screen to refresh on my side. So the end-to-end supplier life cycle is the full suite of activities that happen for your third parties, moving from decisions as to whether you're going to outsource or not, right through to managing that change and termination of that relationship ultimately. One of the things that we don't see happen particularly effectively is the integration between the various parties that are involved. So procurement obviously have a significant impact on this process and manage certain parts of this process. In many larger organizations, that there are third-party risk teams that are separate to those. There may be information security teams. There's obviously the business who often own the relationships with the vendors. And what we don't see is these organizations always effectively working. So there is sometimes a slight risk that, procurement, for example, or finance might have a very positive view of these third parties because the third party pays on time, it hits its service metrics on a regular basis or service credits, it doesn't have any penalties. But information security are doing reviews and we have a very negative view of a third party because we believe that they follow insecure development standards and they might be a risk that they're exposing our data to excessive information risks. So one of the things I think that organizations need to do is to bring those teams together. We recently just did a project helping an organization build a third-party risk framework. Key to that is developing a formal set of roles and responsibilities, a RACI matrix, which makes sure that you agree and approve roles and responsibilities, and that will include a number of stakeholders across the organization, and make sure that those full set of roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are fully understood, which will include, as I mentioned, people from the business, people from information security, people from finance potentially, people from the risk community, as well as supplier owners, etc. So I think that's an area that we see organizations suffering from a building of silos, I guess, and therefore a difficulty in integrating processes into an end-to-end approach. And some of the challenges that has for organizations is presenting a consistent approach to our services. Ultimately, if they have a poor experience dealing with us and providing due diligence activities, that could impact in the service they provide us. So, this is not an immaterial area, and it's important that we get the service that we need from our third parties. So just moving on to the Q&A now, that sort of finishes the main agenda items that we wanted to cover today. I am keen to hand over if there are any questions. I know that our team have been monitoring any of the questions coming in. Toby, do we have any questions coming through?
Yeah, Phil, there's a couple of questions, and I'll just pass those through. So on the first question is, how many companies audit their third parties in order to get comfort about their operational resilience amongst the other areas on third-party risk? Would you say that's from none, 5 to 10%, or is there a larger portion on that?
So is this question specific to operational resilience?
Yeah.
So operational resilience, for those on the webinar who are not within financial services, just in terms of level setting, the regulators are pushing very hard in terms of operational resilience. It effectively is in response to dealing with some of the significant predominantly banking failures that have occurred over the last 5 to 10 years, where customers, for example, haven't been able to get their money. Examples such as NatWest RBS, for example, and an expectation that organisations look at the resilience of their processes. In terms of where third-party risk sits within that, I would say that it's probably not yet. It's probably not the number one focus for clients. I think operational resilience is still, when we talk to our clients, many clients are still at early days. But having said that, I think third-party risk is quickly increasing, and for all of the third-party risk projects that we do, yes, we look at cyber, yes, we look at business continuity, yes, we look at the mapping of services, but third-party risk does perform a component to all of those reviews. So I think it is an important component, but I guess to answer the question, as in terms of how many organisations are looking at it, I think it's still probably got some way to go. Most organisations probably starting from the inside, but they're increasingly starting to recognise that a significant part of their operational resilience risk may sit with third parties. So it is certainly gaining a lot of traction. And the publishing of the paper by the Bank of England, I think, acknowledges the significance of the domain area within the overall operational resilience discipline. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Another question that I've got here is, how effective are organizations you're speaking with at integrating GDPR requirements into their third-party risk management process? Okay.
So organizations have obviously had a while now. It's coming up to 2 years anniversary since the go-live date, for want of a better word. I think, in all honesty, most organizations running up to May 2018 focus more on contracts, and that was probably the right thing to do if you're taking a risk-based approach. So making sure that the relevant clauses have been inserted the data processing agreements have been inserted into commercial terms and conditions with the third parties. That said, I think it's an area for organisations who were sort of focusing on the to-do list post go live, that it's an area that organisations were plugging in 2019. So I think most major third-party risk programs we see have sort of GDPR questions embedded into them. I think it's important for those to be proportionate. So we have seen everything from 3 questions right through to, asking 50, 60, 70 questions around privacy. So it's important that question set is very proportionate to the risk that perhaps you're facing. So clearly some of your third parties who don't hold significant personal data, asking them 70 questions on it may be excessive. So I think there's some fine-tuning that might be required, but we're starting to see for those organisations that have a third-party risk program that the GDPR due diligence questions are starting to become integrated. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Phil.
Other questions? We've got a couple of more minutes, I think, if there's any further questions left.
Yeah, there's a couple more, and I'll try to run through them as well. There's also one that sort of refers to our previous slide, and it really goes to why do you think that third-party risk can suffer from silos, as you mentioned in that slide, and not really working with some of the other business functions?
I think it's like lots of disciplines in big organisations. The disciplines can be built up sometimes in silos. I think the best organisations that we see try and avoid that, but I think it's just the product of large organisations. So, procurement are doing their job, and perhaps in many organisations, procurement's biggest risk is making sure that everyone goes through procurement and being on top of that, because one of their significant risks to procurement is that people buy things and procurement are not even aware of it, depending on the centralisation or not of procurement, of course. And so their priorities and objectives are slightly different. And hence, I think why on the slide that we referenced, thinking about that end-to-end life cycle, one of the best places I think that we've seen was actually a much smaller sort of challenger bank organisation, smaller organisation, less stakeholders, but they had a very integrated approach. Not the most mature process, but you could clearly see a single process sort of managed through sort of integrated procurement, legal, third-party risk, right through the life cycle. So I think there are opportunities to enhance that. Clearly, it's a harder job for larger organisations.
Thanks, Phil. I will squeeze in one last one, and I think we can probably wrap up given the time. Is there a maturity model or a standardized way to measure organizations' maturity of their third-party risk management? And what are the key stakeholders that are involved in such assessment?
So this is where it kind of comes back to shared assessments. So for those of you who are familiar with shared assessments, they do publish a maturity model that we use for clients that want to go down that approach. It is more focused around the information security controls than perhaps some of the other domains, but they publish a maturity model, and you can, if you're looking to enhance your framework, it's worth looking at shared assessments. It's reasonably cheap organization to be a member of, and they do give you a lot of thought leadership. We've actually published a global study for the last probably 5 or 6 years, which provides a lot of benchmark information. It is more focused around the information security requirements, but it does give you the opportunity to get some benchmark information around third-party risk. I'd say it has been more focused around information risk. I think that's where lots of the focus is in the US, where, as I said, there's a lot more of a mature market. But I think that will come because, as I said, the maturing in the European market is increasing, particularly with the in financial services, where the EBA and Bank of England have put out increased guidance. But even across the board, I think GDPR is obviously cross industry and has led to the increased maturity across the piece. So I'd check out shared assessments if people haven't looked at that before. It's worth looking at. So I think we've run over the time slightly, so I wanted to respect everybody's time. Thank you for joining us today. Just a reminder, the recording, if you registered your email address to log into this, the recording will be made available to you, and we will share the materials after this webinar. Please do get in contact if you have further questions. We'll be happy to talk in more depth about any aspects of this. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.